In the spring of 1941, as war clouds gathered, military minds obsessed over aircraft carrier armor and torpedoes. No one imagined that the key to winning this greatest conflict would be held by a man earning only $11 every day. In his hand was a strange-looking tool that high-ranking naval officers mocked as a piece of scrap metal during the war. Inside a cramped garage, he bet everything on a vision that eventually saved 50 million man-hours for the Allied forces. This saga shows how an ordinary man used sparks and steel to burn a hole through tradition and rewrite the rhythm of the war. This is the story of Ted Nelson and his life-saving gun, which takes us back to March 1941 in California. At the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, the air was thick with oil and the roar of clashing metal from submarine production. If you stepped into the dark and damp hull of a submarine, you would feel a crushing sense of total industrial inefficiency. Edward Ted Nelson was there, curled beneath a steel frame, as sweat mixed with iron filings dripped down his welding mask. His spine ached from being bent at angles while working on installing the wooden decking, which was the bane of shipyards. Wood provided better grip in wet conditions and muffled sounds for stealth, but securing these planks was a nightmare. Nelson watched as a dozen strong men spent an entire day just to secure a very small section of the submarine deck wood. According to naval standards, workers had to drill precise countersink holes through thick timber so bolt heads sat flush. To tighten a single bolt, one group on top dropped a bolt while another group crawled into the dark and suffocating bilge. Imagine being squeezed into a space less than 3 feet high, reaching up in total darkness to hand tighten a metal nut. Nelson wrote in his diary with burning anger, "This is madness. There has to be a better way to do this heavy work." To Nelson, the officers and the air-conditioned officers were shouting for speed while refusing to look at the suffering. This level of inefficiency, he knew, would never survive the coming war and the rapid demands of military production. He had spent 15 years in machine shops. He truly understood the complex language of metal and electricity. To him, every technical problem was essentially a logical one that could be solved with enough focus and grit. If the current agony came from the need for two-sided cooperation, could it be simplified into a one-sided operation? If you could fix the bolt from the top of the deck without anyone crawling underneath, you would eliminate the labor. A bold idea struck him like lightning. I am a welder. Why can I not just weld the stud directly onto the steel? At the time, a primitive form of stud welding existed where a worker would sprinkle flux powder on the steel. The worker stood a stud on top and ran current through it, but it only worked on flattened horizontal surfaces. If you tried it on a vertical bulkhead or an overhead ceiling, the powder would simply fall off like white flour. And a warship is nothing but tilted angles, vertical walls, and overhead ceilings that require specialized welding. Without solving the problem of falling flux, the idea of universal stud welding was nothing but a pipe dream. Nelson locked himself in his small workshop, staring at metal components for days. Then the breakthrough came. What if he encased the flux in a tiny ceramic sleeve or ferrule to hold the material in place while welding? This small cap would sit at the base of the stud, holding the flux in place regardless of the angle, horizontal or vertical. It was a solution so simple, it was brilliant. He immediately sketched a handheld tool shaped like a pistol for welding. Pull the trigger, and a massive surge of current would create an instantaneous arc to melt the metal into a strong bond. In less than a second, the metal would fuse, leaving a perfectly bonded stud grown directly out of the steel frame. Armed with this blueprint, Nelson rushed to find Commander Morrison. He was met with total rejection by his superior. He simply said, "Mr. Nelson, we have strict regulations here. If you want to weld, go weld and stop worrying about bolts." Undeterred, Nelson found the chief welding engineer, Hartwell. Hartwell was kinder, but his words were devastating. He told him that people smarter than him had tried to solve this for 20 years and failed. "We have no time for games." That day, As Nelson walked out of the shipyard gates, the fire in his heart was hotter than any welding arc. He saw not just technical conservatism, but the arrogance of a system that refused to improve because of his status. But he could hear the drumbeats of war from across the Pacific. He knew that time was rapidly running out for everyone. In June 1941, Nelson made a decision that shocked everyone around him. He officially resigned. Quitting a high-paying, stable Navy job to chase a strange invention was seen as total social suicide at the time. Emma watched him haul piles of scrap metal into their garage and asked with worried Ted, "This will ruin us." Nelson looked up, his eyes shining with a light she had never seen. "Emma, I am helping the Navy. They do not know it." Over the next few months, Nelson became the neighborhood madman as he obsessed over his strange invention. Late into the night, the blue-white glare of welding sparks would flicker from his small garage windows. He spent every cent of his savings testing hundreds of ceramic formulas and various flux mixtures for the tool. He had to ensure this gun would work in the salty mist of the sea and under heavy deck vibrations. By May 1941, the first functional prototype was born, looking crude yet being an industrial masterpiece. He invited a few old co-workers over for a demonstration of his new welding equipment and prototype. When Nelson welded a stud onto a vertical steel plate, in less than a second, the veteran workers fell silent. One whispered that this thing could save thousands of hours and urged him to show Morrison again. Nelson shook his head and said he would do it himself to prove it to the whole country. In July 1941, the Nelson Special Welding Equipment Company was officially born in a small shop. To build his factory, he took out a $95,000 government loan, which was an astronomical sum. Buried in debt, he waited in his oil-scented workshop for the moment that would change human history. That moment arrived on December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy forever. As smoke rose over Pearl Harbor, the American industrial machine was suddenly pushed to its absolute limit. This was no longer a drill, it was a fight for the survival of civilization against the enemy. President Roosevelt issued a call that shook the world. America must become the arsenal of democracy. We needed ships, thousands of them, submarines, carriers, destroyers, and we needed them now to win. The naval shipyards, once slow-moving bureaucracies, were suddenly in a state of panic to meet demands. The Kaiser shipyards began building Liberty ships at a frantic pace, and Mare Island received urgent orders. But the bottleneck was the extreme shortage of skilled labor to build these massive vessels quickly enough. The old method of fixing decks was still dragging them down as they struggled to meet quotas. What used to take 12 men a week was now failing to keep pace with ships being sunk. In this desperate hour, the very people who had rejected Nelson and finally remembered the mad welder. The first to knock on his door was the Kaiser shipyard, which was desperate for any efficiency. When Nelson performed a demonstration, the manager's jaws dropped as the process was reduced to a rhythm. No scaffolding was required, and no one had to crawl into the dark bilge to tighten metal nuts. A novice could be trained to use the tool in half a day, making it perfect for the war. The improvement in efficiency was not 20 or 30%. It was 10 or 20 times faster. Soon the place that had broken Nelson's heart, the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, sent an emergency order. Commander Morrison did not offer an apology, but he signed an order for 60 guns and 20,000 studs. Nelson's company went from an empty shop to a mountain of backlogged orders overnight as the naval war accelerated. He had to run his factory 24 hours a day, eventually expanding his production lines into the open fields. The fire he had started in his garage was now about to light up the entire Allied war effort across the globe. If the orders from Mare Island were a spark, what followed was a total industrial conflagration during the war. Nelson's stud welding gun ceased to be just a tool, it became a phenomenon of American production and power. Let us shift our gaze from submarines to the windswept flight decks of the Essex-class aircraft carriers at sea. An Essex-class carrier deck was nearly 1,000 feet long and covered in complex wood unplanking and bolts. Under the old rules of drilling and bolting, finishing a carrier deck took hundreds of men months of labor. But when Nelson's gun entered the fray, the timeline was shattered across the industrial front of the nation. A single worker, moving with a rhythmic click and a flash of light, could secure a stud in 1 second. The tedious cycle of drilling, cleaning, aligning, and tightening was replaced by a single powerful motion. But the real magic lay in that tiny ceramic sleeve, the ferrule that workers jokingly called the ring. This humble piece of clay was actually a marvel, concentrating the heat of the arc into a single point. This meant that a stud welded by Nelson's gun was often stronger than the steel plate it was attached to. Navy inspectors, skeptical by nature, would take massive long-handled wrenches and try to snap the studs. The result was the same. The wrench would bend or the bolt snap, but the weld remained an unbreakable part of the ship. Secret weapon news reached the Atlantic. The Royal Navy heard of a magic gun that built ships in half the traditional time. Soon, the technology built the Liberty ships, the cargo vessels that served as the essential allied umbilical cord. With Nelson's prefabrication methods, building a 10,000-ton ship was slashed from 230 days to 4. Every support structure and cable rack was held together by the short, sharp sparks of the Nelson gun in those ships. Now we confront the number 50 million man-hours. This was not a slogan, but a statistic from the War Production Board. Put that in perspective, one person would have had to work in 17,000 B.C. until today to reach it. In an era where seconds meant a falling soldier, 50 million hours were hours snatched back from the jaws of death. The true meaning of this number went beyond speed. It was truly about the emancipation of the humble industrial worker. Before Nelson, ship construction was hazardous. Men were exposed to toxic fumes in unventilated tanks for many hours. His invention allowed thousands of ordinary citizens, many of them women, to master high-efficiency construction in a day. These famous Rosie the Riveters could now perform industrial miracles, transforming the complex into the intuitive work. In 1943, the United States Navy Department performed an act of profound irony toward the man once mocked. They officially awarded the Nelson Company the Army WWII Award for Excellence in War Production on the factory floor. This was the highest honor for a factory. The bureaucrats who once laughed were now standing in his workshop saluting him. At the ceremony, Nelson did not wear a tuxedo or a suit. He stood there in his worn work, clothes smelling of ozone. As the generals praised his vision, Nelson remained humble and said he was just trying to help his brothers home. Those words cut through the pomp. Nelson knew every minute saved on a shipyard was a minute closer to ending the war. To him, this was a rescue mission. When the war finally ended in 1945, many inventions were retired. But for the Nelson gun, peace was only the beginning as America entered an unprecedented post-war building boom. Today, skyscrapers and bridges are held by his methods. Shear connectors bond concrete to steel using his prototype. From cars to appliances, the legacy is everywhere. If you search for stud welding, the first name is still Nelson. It is a global empire built on a welder's name, still sparking in factories from Tokyo to the city of Berlin today. The most important legacy is the human spirit. Why did a man earning $11 solve this global problem? True innovation is born from empathy for the struggle of the worker and a righteous anger against the status quo. Nelson succeeded because he had been in that hall. He felt the ache and the sting, so he was the one to fix it. We are oft unblinded by the strategies of generals, but the gears of history are turned by ordinary men like Ted. He was the madman in the garage who saw a better way. His flickering sparks grew into a lightning bolt of change. It proved that no matter your position, you can change the world. He saved 19,000 years with one spark. Thank you for watching this story of innovation. I am your strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield.